So this is the panel. My name is Arun Majumdar from Google, and this is the panel on ecosystems, which I think we have heard mentioned several times. And we have two excellent panelists, and delighted to have you here. And thanks for traveling all the way. And you have their background. Heather is the president and CEO of the Business Council in New York State, and you have a big mandate in New York, and I hear that you've done some wonderful things. I'd love to hear about that. And we have Christopher Cabaldon, who is the mayor of West Sacramento since 1998. But in addition to that, at the United States Conference of Mayors, he's the vice chair for jobs, education, and workforce. And you have also been involved in K through 12, as well as higher education in California, in community colleges, et cetera. So this is perfect combination of backgrounds at the local level, at the state level, and I used to be at the federal level. I can fill in when necessary. And this is about ecosystems. And we have heard this discussed many times. Ecosystems are important. An ecosystem is, the proximity of competitors, collaborators. We have heard about lead time. And in ecosystem with the proximity, we need design engineers, production engineers, people who can make tools. There's an efficiency to reduce the lead time that'll come from ecosystems. Co-location, and we have heard that Seattle is doing an excellent job in embracing ecosystems, but San Francisco perhaps not as much. And the question really is, and I think there are a lot of people in this country who are thinking about this, and at the end of this discussion, or perhaps through the question and answer, if he can come up with some recommendations, is it how do you cultivate and create this ecosystem? Is it local demand? Is it human and financial capital? Is it talent? We've heard about that. Is it tax incentives? Is it the legal environment? Is it the regulatory environment? What is it? Or is it a combination of all that? Because I think a lot of people, if you were to tell the mayor of a city, another mayor of a city, or the governor of a state, here's the blueprint. Go do it. What would that be? So, Heather, let me start with you. And there are several topics, but why don't you start with your statement and we can go through Q&A.
Well, I mean, I'll start off by saying I have a recipe, so everyone get your pencil and start writing, okay? No, I mean, New York is notorious. High tax state, hard to do business. Lost a lot of population to low tax states over the last several years. But we do have some really tremendous success stories that are driven by a few decisions that were made at the government level. And I'm just going to qualify that by saying it is not my belief that government creates jobs. In fact, I think the best thing that government can do in a lot of instances is get out of the way. But in New York, there was so much in the way that we needed to do something really creative. And I was privileged enough to work on the Senate Economic Development and Budget staff for a number of years while we were trying to attract, actually at the time I think it was Intel, to build a chip manufacturing facility in New York and say, well, never mind our taxes, we'll fix that. Never mind all these other issues. We've got some great assets. We've got higher ed, we've got infrastructure, we've got proximity to market, we've got a lot of things, including a lot of land, which people wouldn't believe, but it's not in New York City, it's in upstate New York. And the biggest influencing factor in that is that idea did not come from government. Government will never have ideas like this on its own, generally speaking. And I'm saying that with a high level of sort of disrespect because I worked in government for so long. Somebody once gave me a t-shirt that said, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." And it was a joke. So what instigated it was the private sector. It was actually IBM that had this vision or idea that that the state should be more focused on where the technology was going, and convince. And it really is about just a limited number of people convincing leadership, political leadership, that there was an opportunity that the state could grasp, and the state leadership actually took the advice of a very senior person at IBM, and developed this plan and moved forward with it. And it took a long time and a lot of state subsidies. But the bottom line is it created value that is creating ancillary value. So a lot of people could argue that putting in, and I'm sorry, I didn't mention the project. It's Global Foundries. At the time that Global Foundries got off the ground, I think it was the largest construction project on the planet for about 5 minutes. If you asked anybody in the state of New York about that, they would have no clue because there's not been a lot of positive news about it. But there's 4,000 jobs there that didn't exist previously. And there are ancillary positive benefits in related companies, in suppliers, in actually the real estate market, in population. It's been very positive. This type of value creation, again, I would say would never in and of itself come from government. So the point that I would want to leave people with here, and then I'll let someone else talk, I'll let the mayor talk, is that there have to be really 3 components. You need to have the private sector involved, really have to be involved in identifying where the opportunities lie in creating local ecosystem value. What are the strengths that are there already and what are the opportunities? Government is never going to identify them on its own. And when they start picking and choosing winners and losers, there's politics involved, and that's not a good thing. There needs to be a strong education connection, higher ed and K through 12. IBM is also a partner in a project in New York that is going to be replicated, I expect, across the country that recognizes that local companies can help fill workforce needs by being involved in K through 12 education. And the last thing I think that is so important, and this is really what's missing in most of the country, is there needs to be advocacy by the private sector in government at the local level, not just at the U.S. the U.S. level, talking about immigration, which I recognize is a huge issue, especially in New York, but looking at local business policy. There's very little involvement with larger companies in advocacy locally, and that's really, really something that's very important.
Fantastic. Christopher?
Yeah, I love the ecosystem analogy, and I think it's actually in some sense more than that. But I feel a lot of times like I'm at a scopes trial conversation, but it's happening in our own heads one at a time, which is we describe this ecosystem, and then we instantly are looking for the intelligent designer, and we're trying to pull back the curtain. Well, who is the one that is running this? Who's decided this? And then we want to borrow it whole. Right, so I just got back from the Galapagos. Why can't our animals cooperate better here? Right? I saw this amazing black and white, thing that kind of looked like a bear in China. What are we doing wrong in Minneapolis that is not producing that? And so if you accept the ecosystem notion, it requires a lot more humility than we bring to that work around what the knobs and levers are that we really have, and much less focus on the panda. And the cooperation of the Galapagos, but really on what the pieces are that we do. Fundamentally, what are we doing? Because as a mayor tackling this sort of economic development challenges generally, I know what I'm supposed to do, which is convene a task force, appoint a chief value creation officer, put value creation is back flags on our downtown light poles. It's pretty standard stuff. And if I ask the local, economic development and business folks, they'll say what you need to do is, lower taxes, provide more incentives, and cut red tape. If I ask the civic elite, they'll say, no, what you need is opera and more art galleries to attract talent. If I ask others, they'll say, no, there's too much income inequality, and you need to tackle homelessness. If you don't deal with the root causes of societal dysfunction, you won't have long-term sustainable value creation. And all of those have something to contribute, but none of them are the answer. In fact, those answers were the answers to my problems last week, too, from exactly the same people. And the week prior to that, they were the answer to that, too. And so I'm very skeptical of I have the answer, and because I just came back from Shanghai or whatever, those are they're all inputs into the piece, but I don't run it, right? Even the notion that government has a role to play, government is also, in some sense, separate from all this, its own ecosystem. Right, I don't run government even in my own city. I have my own organization that I operate just like a company, except it's controlled by unions and by voters and others simultaneously. But there's a million other governments there. There's somebody else that provides, that runs the levy system. There's somebody else that runs the school system, because talent doesn't matter to a city, only picking up the garbage and flushing the toilet. Talent's handled by some other separate company, essentially, that's not in any way controlled by us, and often not influenced by us. And then there's the state. Right, we've kind of wrapped in this panel the states and localities together, but that's a ridiculous concept, right? If you, unless you came from another sector, you would never do that, because we're not even in the same genus, really. Right? When you think about as a city, or even as a metro area, which I think we may get to this conversation around how metros can be more coherent and competitive and innovative, rather than thinking about the individual jurisdictions. But the fundamental thing that we share is that we care about the place, right? So my job is evolving and supporting, nurturing, creating the place where collisions happen. Right? That's the unique thing about the metro. That's not reflected necessarily on the floor of the House of Representatives, where there's a lot of folks who represent people who don't want to be next to anybody else. In cities in particular, but also our suburbs, it's about the collisions and creating enough useful collisions for the sort of innovation to occur, for folks to be the collisions that shake you up and cause you to think about problems differently. That has to complement being locked up in a Google campus in the Silicon Valley, isolated from, you need time to do that too, but you also need time to be on the, well, I was going to say the bus, but Google and bus in the Bay Area is not, it's not a good matchup. But you need times where you need at least episodic moments where you're forced to deal with other people and their realities, and whether the consumers are, and other situations that can cause it. Cities are all about that, right? Now we have to manage that, right? Because we don't want you on the subway for hours and hours. We don't want too much friction and too many collisions, but about creating those useful collisions. That's a function of place. And so cities and metros are really concerned about that. States, on the other hand, for the most part, and states are much more variable, they're organized functionally. Right? So the state, so I care about the place, and if you say, look, I want to do this new innovation district, but it's going to be tough because you have the zoning rule that says I can't do that. Well, the value of that innovation district is higher to me than the value of this zoning rule that was put in place 50 years ago. So I can do that at the city. If you're the state, the way we organize those governments, it's, no, I'm in charge of water quality, period. And I'm optimizing on water quality. That other people over there are in charge of air quality, somebody else is in charge of economic development. So if I say, I'm about to manufacture a widespread, a cure for cancer that I can bring to market next week, but it will cause me to raise the temperature of the water in this pond that nobody uses, that's off the side of my property by 1 degree. The water quality person, there's no framework for them to say, okay, is curing global cancer more important than the temperature change in a body of water that is not drank or swam in or fished in? They can't do that, right? So states are organized fundamentally different. They're not about place. They're about those functions and those interests, which in some ways make them counterproductive in the kind of work that we're talking about. So I think we need to peel both ecosystem about what it means, but also even the sense that government is in some sort of intelligent design mode as well.
Very well defined. I think from what I gather is, yes, I mean, the collisions are very important. But on the state level, you're at the state level, I think we all agree that education is really critical. And you have been involved in education as well. Mm-hmm. So perhaps you could just shed some light as to, what are the key, how would you create the workforce and the talent so that Nicky can come over here and bring his company over here to utilize the talent? What would you do? And what are the key ingredients for that?
Wow, if I knew the answer to that. Well, are we doing a good job? I can tell you right now, I know New York statistics, and I will qualify that by saying I'll be generally almost correct on numbers. I'm a lawyer. I can't be trusted with numbers usually, but right now, New York State, K through 12, about 35% of our kids who graduate are graduating ready for something else. 65 to 70% of them need some additional remediation before they are ready to go to college or ready to step into the workforce. So, we're right now failing almost 2/3 of our kids before they ever get to higher ed, which is why, by the way, the average time to a 4-year degree now is 6 years. Because 2 of those years, then a lot of money is spent trying to rebuild all the skills and the things that they should have known before they went to college. And it's very difficult to implement change in New York's education system. IBM and the P-TECH school, which I made reference to earlier, which provides some actual advanced applied skills in the high school setting, is a glaring exception to really what's going on in most of the districts. We're right now implementing a replication of the P-TECH model across the state. My organization is actually hosting the RFP process, and the schools. Next year we should have 16 new high schools open, but this is in a state that has 700 districts. So this is just a drop in the bucket. We're also trying to implement the Common Core standards right now. It has become highly political because it is tied to teacher evaluations. So there's a huge political motive to stop, shut down, confuse people about what higher standards mean. So I'm up to my eyeballs in a fight over education right now. But I will say this, we have new recognition at the state level and across, I think, statewide through this conversation that we need to connect K through 12 to higher ed, to the private sector. Stop with all these silos, because if you're teaching kids, there was a reference in chemistry before, if you're teaching them chemical reactions based on a 100-year-old formula or a 100-year-old method that has no practical application, the kids aren't going to understand what it's for. They're not going to be interested, and these are kids that can get information off the internet in 2 seconds. We need to have them have hands-on experience, see why they're learning these skills. Why does STEM matter? Why does it matter? What are the math skills? And they're not going to learn that from government. They're going to have to learn that from the private sector, which means private sector has to collide with higher ed and K through 12. So I'm all for tearing down the easier said than done in a state that has huge bureaucratic walls in between, education and the private sector, and so it's very challenging, but it's starting, and I think that's like the key factor really to creating any kind of an ecosystem, is if you can tear down these separations and let business, government, and by the way, I wouldn't shut government out, I would include them at the table as long as they're not coming with their enforcement hat on and they're coming with their I want to help hat on. We need to make more of those hats. But
Other examples from around the world where the private sector and the government have actually gotten involved in education, in apprenticeship, or things like that. Have you guys looked into that, and can you shed some light? Maybe Christopher, you could.
Yeah, there are, and there are lots of islands of examples even in this country. But I think part of the challenge is again peeling that back, right? So there's a lot of recommendations, even in the book that we got when we came today, has recommendations of what should the education system look like, and that's great. But there's an underlying engineering problem. How does that get designed, and how does that get accomplished given the very serious path dependency that we're already stuck on, right? So there are schools that are figuring this out one at a time. So P-TECH is a good example. In California, there's whole districts that are trying to grapple with a school system that you would never design it the way it is today, right? So we expect every student in California is going to become, they'll all take Algebra 2. Right, so we insist that you become, I was going to say become fluent, but we insist that you sit in a certain number of hours of instruction around cosines, which you will never remember. But we don't have any affirmative intentional instruction around how to fail or how to innovate, or any of the soft skills, or my favorite term is the non-cognitive skills, because they don't involve any thinking. Right, the elements that we talked about today, which are what's needed, right? Because the curriculum, those subject matters are, they're artifacts of a particular time, and they're also about a time when it really was the teacher has knowledge that I can get only from that teacher. Now that is not the issue, right? What I need to know is there's unlimited amounts of information out there. How do I get it? How do I process it? How do I interpret it? How do I apply it? How do I share with others? And so that becomes much more of the challenge, but where schools are not designed to do that. So and our curriculum is also not designed to do that. And in part, a lot of us, over the last couple of decades have tried to tackle that by saying, let's go back to when, my favorite phrase is, remember when schools really worked, and we had wood shop and metal shop, and kids got great job. The ones that were destined ready for college went there, and the other ones got a great job. There was never that many carpenters really in our economy. It was most of the folks that say that today are the ones that went on to the university track, but have romanticized those moments where they had an interesting shop class. The shop class didn't actually make you more better at geometry. It could have, but it didn't. In fact, it reminded you how boring geometry was. And so what some schools are doing now is to say, no, we can integrate that curriculum together, right? And so that you're learning and doing simultaneously. That's not a radical idea. It is in schools. It also means restructuring the curriculum, though. And so I've been working with a bunch of schools, both locally and elsewhere, that have engineering academies. Project Lead the Way is a good example, if you're familiar with their model. But the problem is the students take these courses in engineering and develop very strong technical and math skills, but they don't meet the university's course pattern requirements for things like math. And why? Well, so over 4 years of an engineering high school program, they've learned more about geometry than anyone else, or physics. But it wasn't packaged as this semester's geometry and then this semester is physics, right? And so we have this problem of just, it is partly getting those two institutions together, but it's really focusing fundamentally on what do we want those students to be able to do at the end of that program, and then allow them to do that. It also means opening it up a little. It's such a monopolized industry that kind of, I'm waiting not to I didn't try to fix the taxi system in my city. I'm like, okay, Uber, Lyft, you want to operate here? Come here, we will let you, we'll take the guardrails off and you can operate here. That was simpler to me than trying to fix the intense politics and institutions that had grown up around the taxi industry. And to some extent, that has to happen. It's more likely at universities and community colleges than it is in K-12 because we're so protective of K-12 because it's our kids. But it has to happen, and I think higher ed's very, very, very ripe for some disruptive innovation.
Let me come to infrastructure in a minute, about the transportation, et cetera, which is, I think, critical. Let me push you both on the education side, just once more. If I look around this room, and I'll speak for myself, but look around this room, many of us came to this country because of the education system. And if you look at the network of higher education, when all the state universities and private universities, and I trace back to when that happened, it is something that Dan mentioned right up front in the morning. It goes back to 1862 when the Morrill Act was signed, and that is in the middle of a freaking civil war, okay? Now, if you think big on the long term as to what we should be doing with the education system, you mentioned private-public partnership. We're looking for big ideas in this Making Value for America. For a long-term view of this, what would you suggest? Give me your top idea.
Well, one is what is I think you're already engaged in, which is the whole work around skill certification, which is part of a larger push around competency-based assessment, stackable credentialing, sort of getting out of the notion that it's either about seat time or that there's a bachelor's degree and then there's nothing else, right? But valuing those sorts, all the things that underlie that, and also that a bachelor's degree is 4 years, right? That it may be that you go and you do this piece right now, you get this, you build this competency, and that stacks on another one. You might get your bachelor's degree in 2 years. You might get it in 30, right? That's the point is not the degree. The point is what competencies and capacities do you have at that moment. But that has to get built. That will not come because a school board or a university board of regents says, hey, let's shift away from the Carnegie unit and seat time and degree structure to something wholly different. And it won't come because the business council issues a report calling for it, or I direct somebody to do it locally. That comes because there has to be an alternative set of credentials and certifications, right? So the extent that those become standardized, then enterprising superintendents and local chambers and mayors together can say, okay, in our district, what we're going to start doing, the high school diploma is going to come with a portfolio of these credentials, and we're going to insist that every student graduate with at least one industry-recognized credential. That's how the change starts to happen, and then you can start rolling them up into regional expectations around what students know and do. Then states. It won't happen from the education institution saying it outward, but we need those. We need those. Even in the last couple of years, there's been huge interest by high schools and community colleges in this career readiness question, but they don't know how. They don't know what to do. Like we want to measure and reward career readiness, but what is it, and how would we know? And could we just add 3 questions to the SAT? No. But what is it? And the best way to do that is this emerging work on competencies, badging, and particularly in terms of what the academies and others are doing is on the skill certification side, I think.
Yeah, I mean, the answer I would give is maybe a little bit similar to what I said before, but I think that we need to fundamentally shift away from this idea that education, both K through 12 and higher education, is a fact-based set of things that you need to know. Because we can get all those facts now in ways that we never could before. I mean, I have a law degree. You know, you can do most of what lawyers do looking things up on the internet. You can find forms, you can find examples. I mean, you can even find most of the case law if you ever wanted to read any of this stuff. But I think more importantly is we need to think about shifting about how to learn and how to apply skills and how to fail. I think that is, I actually gave a whole speech on the value of failure to a group in Corning, New York. I think understanding that failure is a good thing and it's part of a process is great. I'm a host member of the First Robotics Regional Competition, which is being held at RPI. And I'm really proud of that because it's experimentation and it's the kids are learning how to make things, how to fail, and they have to fail 100 times before they can win this competition because they've had to experiment with understanding how all the elements work together. And that's not something they learn in school. This is a program that should be in the schools. This is the kind of thing that people should be learning is how to fail, how to show up, and also the value of finishing something. And this is just a total off topic, but I was asked a couple weeks ago about why we're having such a problem at entry level. We've got manufacturing positions open right now in New York that pay $12 an hour. They're not sexy jobs. They're working in a factory making cabinets or assembling things. And they have a very hard time finding people who want to do these jobs because they've never been asked to be somewhere 4 days, 5 days a week at 7 a.m. The kids, there's no expectation that, that completing something has a huge amount of value because it's not something they've been taught in school. So, I mean, that's a side issue because it's more at the entry level, but there's a problem there too.
But it's partly taking it as seriously as the kids do. A lot of us romanticize like the first 2 years of our university experiences. It's a time of exploration, and we don't want to ask kids to think about careers before that, or make it. And we ought to have those options. But that's actually not the norm for most kids. Want to have an anchor. Right, so like kids, I was with a girl 2 days ago in Antioch High School, and she's in the engineering academy. She wants to be an artist, but her dad said, no, that's not a good career, so she's in the engineering academy. She loves the academy. It's causing her to think about art in a completely different way, but it's engaging. It's something. It engages her, and it's a complete program. It's not just this semester I'll take this because it's open, and that one, my girlfriend's in that one, or whatever. It's around something that's complete that then the process of doing a complete thing itself is of value, even if you switch sectors. But it's also around ending this permeability between you don't think about career until, or you don't do career until you graduate from high school. Because it isn't just, it's not, we have this very felt need to try to make it all sound good, right? So we need to teach kids how to work in teams and how to collaborate. Those are all positives. But kids need to experience failure, but they also, well, what happens when the people you've been counting on screw up, when they don't deliver, right? What happens when your boss doesn't seem to give a damn about you? That's not, as you go through school, even in the work the kind of applied projects that your teacher gives you, your teacher, he or she's spent 2 weeks thinking about how does this all come together in the end, right? There's, how does this result in success? When you actually show up at the workplace, that's not how your boss is not like that. Your boss is not, oh, Arun, okay, here's my plan for you. Even if I'm not telling you, I know that this will ultimately work. This will ultimately pay off in some way. That's not the real world, and it's one of the areas where students struggle the most in that transition point. So let's get them to that point earlier. Where there's, if you've ever played D&D as a kid, where there's no dungeon master that makes sure that the whole thing is coherent, because that's how life is. But that's one of the hardest parts, and for employers, it's the biggest challenge that they face, because then the student arrives and expects that kind of coherent, holistic, intentional environment that does not exist, and then they're much more likely to fail. So to the extent to which students can do more internships, more work-based learning experiences while they're in high school, even if it's not in the curriculum, it connects much better to college and career readiness later on.
And I could connect that back to ecosystems quickly, because I would just say that the best examples of where you have successes are when you look around higher education campuses. I mean, RPI right now in Troy, New York, there is a cluster of small gaming companies. No government intervention there. No one said, I have an idea. I think that this is a great location for gaming companies. It was a bunch of students, one graduate, you know, a kid graduated, but his girlfriend was still there, so he needed something to do for a couple years. So he took his hobby and turned it into a company, but it went through an incubator. And there were advisors and people to help them with the business side of it to transition this idea and this hobby into a company that now employs like 75 people. So it's not a complete connection, but it's applied learning, internships, and also the support of getting from the higher ed setting to the private sector. And entrepreneurship, the way that that will happen is going to be through the support of higher education, but also involvement, other companies getting involved, CEOs being willing to talk to someone starting a company in the community. So there needs to be more than just higher education is here and the businesses are here and government is here. I mean, everybody needs to kind of get together and cooperate.
Let me turn the discussion to infrastructure. Government is about common good. Infrastructure, broadly speaking, I mean, sometimes when we talk about infrastructure, we always talk about, you know, whether it's fiber or internet, but it's transportation. Trust me, Google pays a lot of attention to busing in San Francisco. So it's that, it's, all aspects of the infrastructure. And we heard today, I think Jamie mentioned that he went to Brazil to set up a plant, and frankly, it was very difficult because it wasn't quite there. And so infrastructure clearly matters a lot in ecosystem. How do you think about this? When you created the ecosystem in New York, the state of New York, and on the state-wise, and it's obviously important on the local side, to create the collisions. How do you think about this?
Well, I think first off, spending government dollars and resources on infrastructure is a very high value spend of that money. I mean, I think we're rebuilding the Tappan Zee Bridge right now, and it's depending on who you ask, $3 to $5 billion project. That is an appropriate and valuable use of taxpayer funds and state resources, and you can't find, I mean, to me, other than the provision of direct services, that really is the other huge value that that government can provide. So, and it is something that we do not market well. New York has excellent transportation infrastructure in the city. Upstate, it's not great, but we have a great network of roads, railroads. We even have a canal system. We've got ports. We don't market it well, and that is something that would give, when you look at ecosystems, that those are competitive advantages that we don't recognize necessarily. And by the way, I would include higher education and workforce as part of the infrastructure definition.
Yeah, I think in government we sometimes get in this trap. Infrastructure is always a good thing, and it is if you are not resource constrained. If you're not resource constrained, right? Because there's better bets and worse bets. But I think also part of the challenge that we face that I think we're starting to see some movement on is we should be much more opportunistic with our infrastructure investments. Because I mean, when I go home, I will declare that we're a food innovation hub or something. That's what mayors do. But that's not real, right? So the reality is all the knobs and levers that we can press, and then hope that everyone else in the ecosystem will happen to align in the way that will make that all work, and we get it wrong at least half the time, and something else will emerge, but maybe even better. But we're obsessed with, okay, I have a 15-year capital outlay plan. And it's based on a wide variety of inputs, none of which actually have anything to do with economic development. So if I'm looking at roads, which roads are going to move the most number of people from A to B? Okay, that's great. And there's another potential road that goes from B to C. And I'm looking at the two. Well, A to B moves more people, and there's this company there. This neighborhood's really loud on this one, and they're not as loud on that one. But we don't think about the leveraging opportunities, in part because the time frame doesn't allow it. Or I can say, well, if a couple companies wanted to kick in 1% of the cost of this, that should move my needle to say, okay, I want to both because it helps to support that piece of infrastructure, but also because it's a credible commitment that that infrastructure will actually leverage the growth of that cluster or that sector in that area. But I can't really do that very effectively under our existing system because I still have to apply for some federal, for some federal grant to do it. That has to get processed through the state, through the region. It goes through a million different things, none of which care about real private participation. And so I think pushing some of the infrastructure investments to the metros will help in that dimension, but also then giving metros both the ability and the incentives to use them really to leverage, to be able to see what is happening in this ecosystem and how can I use this infrastructure to help? Because too often they're disconnected. So my infrastructure investments are good, but they could have been much, much better if I had the authority and it wasn't all formula driven, and two, I was encouraged by the funding sources to pay attention to what all the other key actors and species in my ecosystem were doing.
I was just going to say the one qualifier on infrastructure that I would make is that I think no matter what, the funding, the state side funding, the federal funding, there's always a political component to it, which actually causes a lot of really dumb infrastructure investments also. And so there's a lot of good examples of really wasted money. I mean, we built more stadiums in New York for, I don't even know, for local minor league soccer teams, and that you don't get the return on investment. So it would be nice if there was an objective guy, woman, someone up there looking at it going, no, that's dumb, that's not dumb, that's going to get you some value. That's just, getting someone some political value. That doesn't exist as far as I know.
Would it be good to have that to actually look at an objective, in a quantitative way of looking at what value could be created?
Yeah, but I think that's all. A lot of that is in a context, right? So
right.
If the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department gives me money to build this gigantic project, that's a great investment if it is also then connected by a streetcar line to the major employers, right? It's a stupid investment if it's marooned all by itself. But up until like a year or two ago, HUD, the housing department, wouldn't talk to the transportation department and say, hey, I'm going all in this place over here. But I'm over here. Maybe what if but these investments only work really if we put them together. And so that's getting out of this sort of the functional approach to government and more towards the placemaking approach to government, which requires you to braid those streams together.
So think of it holistically as opposed to individually.
Right, but it's more than just saying to HUD, think holistically, or saying to the U.S. Department of Transportation, think holistically. Because it's like fundamentally you can't do that. That's like that's saying to a fish, think like you're in the air. You can't. Well, you have to change where and how that decision gets made. So that's partly pushing
that's your point as well.
Pushing it to the metros, and then second, creating so that when I'm reporting back on all of those outcomes, not just on how many people did I move from A to B. So like right now I'm evaluating a light rail line versus a streetcar line. The light rail line actually moves more people, but the streetcar line has many, many more ancillary economic development impacts in terms of the density of housing and the amount of mixed-use development and office parks and that sort of thing. And so if I'm just looking at transportation, the light rail line's a better bet. If I'm looking at the total impact on the local economy, the streetcar is a clear winner. But it's unusual for us to be able to do that in the first place. And then second, government could use better tools in sort of assessing, aggregating, and indexing the variant benefits.
How would you, first of all, does it make sense to incentivize the private sector, for example, to create an infrastructure? And if so, what would you do?
Yeah, I think it certainly makes sense to incentivize the private sector to create an infrastructure, but there's a difference between incentivizing a company and incentivizing a group of companies, because if it's a company, then the competition and the profit-making motive may eclipse some of the value that gets delivered to the rest of the community. So you want to make sure that, and there's a great example of that also in New York. We've got the Albany Nanotech Center, 5 or 6 different IT companies have collaborated, invested in a research facility that will benefit all of them ultimately. And I would count that as infrastructure. I think about, if I was going to make a specific recommendation with respect to that, it would be when you have government looking at investing in infrastructure, they should at least consult with the private sector and not just one person, whoever is willing to come to the table. Great example in New York, we spent a couple $100 million on IT in all our state agencies, and none of them could talk to each other. So we had to spend another like $200 or $300 million making them all interactive, and it still doesn't work. I mean, and that was just dumb. If they had 4 consultants from 4 different IT companies come in and look at the overall plan, that problem would have been avoided entirely for a lot cheaper, and it probably would have ended up with a much better system.
If you think about what the underlying purpose of that infrastructure, we have a lot of idle sort of quasi-infrastructure at least in metros like mine. So if the purpose of my light rail line or my streetcar line is to get people from job to home to job, or job to church, or child care center to Whole Foods Market, whatever it is, then if you take a step back, okay, if what's happening with Uber and Lyft is that they are activating all this empty space in people's cars or in fleet cars to make those trips happen. No private company built the light rail line that I was thinking about, but if someone else is solving the actual problem of moving people from point A to point B, that is saving me infrastructure costs potentially, if I know how to count that properly. But it's also true with our public stuff, right? So it's very hard to open a restaurant in most places or to sell stuff on the street, because unlike a lot of other countries, we require a full, gigantic $500,000 commercial kitchen on your first day, and there's all these regulatory requirements, and so it's difficult. But I've got 16, high schools that have cafeterias with fully licensed commercial kitchens that are not used every single night and every weekend, which are not bad times for a lot of restaurants. So could we use the idle assets that we already have, and we have a lot of them, that government has invested in, the private sector has invested in, that are sitting there doing not much of anything, and either us directly or unleashing through some of the regulatory things that allow for an Airbnb to happen, or the things that take advantage of those systems that provide an alternative to our traditional notions of what infrastructure are all about.
Let me ask you about global competitiveness, because we heard a lot about that in the previous panel. The things going on in China, there are the huge markets, consumer markets elsewhere in the world. When you think about this, in terms of, for example, state of New York, and you want to create an ecosystem that is globally competitive, but it's local, how do you think about that in terms of, or for example, if you wanted to attract Nikki's company, I'm following up with a question that that Nick had. If you want to attract 10 of those companies to come and make investments so that you have economic growth and create value, what would you do? How do you think about this?
Well, I think first I'd change our immigration policy. That's one.
That's a given.
I mean, in New York, and again, can't be trusted with numbers or statistics really as a lawyer, but we do graduate allegedly more engineers than anyone else, any other state. And we export them, and probably a good half of the ones the engineer degrees that we export are people who are here on foreign student visas, and that's really unfortunate because there is an actual shortage of engineers in New York for a lot of my companies, Welch Allen Medical Device Manufacturer. So that's one thing. And that's I'm done with my immigration speech, I think. But no, I mean, I think that the answer is that we have to stop thinking of ourselves as competing with the state or the local community next door, and start thinking about we're competing on a global level, and think bigger. New York doesn't even have a cogent policy with respect to Canada, which we we're attached to them. It's completely insane. It's a huge pain to do business between Montreal and Plattsburgh. Locally, the local economic development municipal entities have started figuring that out. And I think we should look at their solutions and then maybe magnify those kinds of solutions. Someone was talking earlier about marketing, and I personally, just an observation, I've been to South and Central America a number of times, and there's virtually no U.S. company presence down there because we haven't recognized the opportunity and we don't know how to market to those companies. We should be focusing on bringing in foreign experts, learning from them. Companies should be thinking about global markets, not we want to keep we want to compete with a guy who's over in Connecticut or in Pennsylvania, which makes no sense to anyone here except I'm from New York. So those are our neighbors. It has to be that policies and activities for local ecosystems think more broadly than we're competing with the state or the community next door, but we're competing with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I think that is a great point. So many U.S. metros have been balkanized, and it's partly just because we're so self-confident, so self-referential that we think that is our competition, and we don't think, or it's the metro next door, and I think that's partly changing. It has to change much more. The metros have to become more coherent, integrated places. Because a lot of what I think we'll hear about later today, but we've also started to hear about the power of kind of the metro downtowns and that sort of where the Google's in the office towers and the cafes and the other collisions that occur there. That is essential. But that doesn't mean that the suburban ring around those metros is unimportant. Or that they're simply vassals in service of the downtown. The downtown is part of that metro ecosystem, but many places struggle, both suburb to suburb competition, but also this constant battle between the core and the periphery. And we don't have a communist party to kind of sort that all out for us. We have to do that on our own. So I do think that is one challenge. Second is we do have to do a better, and none of this is to say this is the answer, because I'm not an intelligent designer. But it does feel like there are certain things where we're kind of shooting ourselves, and there's no reason to do that. So that's one. The other is this whole this functional government approach that we have here that doesn't allow us to make any of those trade-offs. So if I can say in my own community, people are like, we want more dance clubs. Okay, that's going to mean a little bit more noise. That's fine. But because there's no city noise agency that is responsible for assuring that nobody's exposed to any more than this amount of noise. But our government is riddled with that sort of thing, and our system of government is very much based on not taking enough risk, which is what I heard earlier. It's like no risk at all. We will not allow any risk whatsoever. That's our system of laws is all about that. Even the chance that one child could be injured if this were to occur. This every week. This is my daily existence at City Council, is hearing that refrain. And so then we impose all these regimens that make it impossible for any good things to happen, right? Because we're simply trying to make sure that nobody gets hurt. And so folks come and they testify at my city council saying, do not allow this company to come here because what if this were to happen? I'm like, well, but the chances that your child will be hurt were much higher when you just drove him with you to the city council meeting. The chances of an auto accident were much, much greater than missiles flying at the port that is in my city. But we needed to have a plan for missiles. And that sort of approach that we have it's endemic in our culture here, but it gets expressed in our system of laws, becomes extremely stultifying. And it was a luxury we could afford before. It is no longer the case. And we have to start assessing risk, applying risk assessment better in our public policy and our regulatory structure at all levels of government.
So I'm told that the audience is hungry to ask questions.
Oh.
Good one.
So let's open that up to the audience. Any questions for the panelists? Larry.
Thank you for your input. In both examples, you tend to refer to situations where maybe the government is not getting its job done. And how do you hold the government accountable? I agree the public sector has an important role to play with education. I went to a cooperative engineering school and it served me very well throughout my career, but at the same time, if only 35% of the students are prepared coming out of the school system, having the private sector get engaged locally just seems like they're doing the public sector's job. So how do we drive accountability and really raise these standards and get higher performance out of the tax dollars?
Well, I mean, I have so many solutions that will never happen to that. I mean, I think that there's far too much partisan influence in all decision-making, public policy, which is what government is, to the extent the government makes policy, it's supposed to be in the good of the public, and it usually isn't. I think that, really, we have to make sure that decisions and regulatory structures and bureaucracies are not built based off of what is going to get someone reelected in office. And I sound like I'm making a speech on taking money out of politics, but the answer is not taking money out of politics for only one set of people who participate. You either take it out for everyone, or you let everyone fully participate, because right now the rules are so screwed up that you've got inequities across the country and who gets a voice. And so that's part one of it. It's very hard to hold the public sector accountable if there's no ability for people to be critical of them without having, eggs thrown at you. I mean, our commissioner of education was asked to resign in public hearings like 17 times because he had the audacity just to stand up and say that we're failing our kids. It was viewed as a criticism of the unions. The unions are very organized, and so it was an unfortunate result. I mean, we need to stop with the partisan crap and start thinking about what the ultimate objective is. And that is not an official position of the Business Council in New York State.
Nice.
Well, it should be, right? Because because I think part of our problem is that we want accountability I want government to be accountable to me and my enlightened, rational view of the world. But really what I want is for the government not to be accountable to all those crazy people that are around me, which is most of the people. Particularly because government, all of our decisions are in the public, and they're all highly atomized. Right? So what the public really says to me when they vote for me in an election is, I want a healthy downtown, I want safe schools, I want, this is the kind of the state of the world that I would like to see. And then from that point on, what I ask them every week in public hearings and everything, so do you think density should be 16.2 units per acre or 18.1 units per acre? 16.2, right? It's a natural human tendency to have an opinion about everything, even if you don't know even if you didn't 10 seconds ago. So we ask them all these intermediate questions, and they develop very strong opinions about all the intermediate things. And then in the end, it doesn't add up to that vision of the world, right? So density is a great example. It's my favorite one because people always say, give me the lower density, always. And if I say, so should we have free parking downtown and lots of parking lots for free parking? Yes, I want free parking, and I want low density, and I want a downtown that's walkable and full of restaurants and bands on every corner. And it's because we have taken those decisions, reduced them down and then invited the public to be engaged in those, which no company would do. You wouldn't say, okay, here's a drug, and what do you think? Should we add one more carbon atom or not? Because people will say, yes, we should. I love carbon. Carbon is the stuff of life, right? I want more of that, right? You don't say that. You say, okay, in the end, what I want is a drug that works. Fundamentally, that's the core. And we've made our democracy so consumerist and also so much of it like a sport and entertainment that the process has become so much more important than the outcome. Now, one reason that happens is that we get up right up to the line, and then we're like, okay, but I can't. That's not our official position. Or I just want this to happen. I don't want all the politics, but other people do. Right, so as long as the firefighters union and this, this home builder over here and everyone else, as long as they are fully engaged in politics while the rest of us are not, then they will, there's that gravity that will pull politics in their direction. And if you're not willing to get your hands dirty and fight with them, then you will have to accept the outcome, or you change the system in some other way. So it does require being political in order to stop the system to be overtaken by other people's nutty politics. One concrete thing that would be helpful, though, is we need better metrics, right? So one reason why the public says, well, I'll just vote for whoever the firefighters union says because I love firefighters. Or I'll vote for whoever the teachers union says for the school board, I'll vote for them. Or whoever the chamber says, I'll vote for them because I love business. I love having a job. That's because they don't have any other markers. There's no other badges of how effective their governments and their political leaders are at delivering what they really care about. So they end up having to rely upon proxies that claim, by the the shroud of the bunnies and babies that are around them, that they can tell them what the great mystery is around whether their governor or their mayor or their school board is actually doing a good job. So the extent to which folks who know the data and can help develop meaningful and understandable metrics, I think that it doesn't solve everything, but it will help in allowing the public to assert a little bit more control around outcomes-based assessment and accountability of government.
Question up there, and then I'll come to you over there.
Thanks. Hari Pujar from Merck. Apologies for taking too much airtime here, but I had a burning question for Heather. So I'm suffering from some cognitive dissonance here. We heard about Taiwan, where the government is really promoting the semiconductor industry. There are other examples like that, Ireland, Singapore, etc. But I also, agree with what you said earlier, that government should get out of the way, right? So I'm trying to reconcile the two. And is it because of the system of the government that Christopher just elegantly described a minute ago, or is it something else that doesn't mesh?
Well, so I hate to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but when I say I want the government to get out of the way, I would like them to proactively get out of the way by making life easier. So I would like the government to actually go and proactively create an environment that's more conducive to job growth, value creation. And right now we live in a state, New York, where our regulatory structure is subject to a lot of public input, a lot of political influence, and that's really unfortunate. So, I mean, it sounds contradictory, but I think there should be less input in some of this, and that's sort of to your point. I mean, we're having a debate right now on natural gas exploration, which I had to be careful not to say hydrofracking because that's like a dirty word in New York. But we have 80 years of experience in New York drilling for natural gas. No new permits have been issued in 4 years because of a debate about a different method for drilling for gas that's not even happening in the state, and no one can even try because there's a complete political outcry over some potential environmental hazards which have not occurred anywhere where this has taken place. And New York, in fact, it never occurred previously, despite the fact that we were already drilling for 80 years. So, but the political pressure and the political noise has ground everything to a halt. That's an instance where the government could absolutely get out of the way, but it would have to do so by doing something, and that'd be by making some very difficult political decisions. So, I mean, the answer is you can have policies that attract, entice certain sectors, and in our case, Global Foundries was built off of, in part, a huge investment of state funds, but also a lack of understanding of what the industry was. I think if there were people in state government, or if there was a common understanding of what was entailed in chip manufacturing, it never would have happened. The ignorance of the process and sort of the not understanding the full implications of such a large-scale construction project allowed it to happen. By the way, I think that's why things like Uber work, things like what has happened in the IT space. The government hasn't caught up in understanding, or maybe even just the general public or the political world hasn't caught up with understanding what everything is, so they don't know how to regulate it. So you have organic growth and creativity and innovation occurring. Awfully cynical view of the world, but.
Well, I think government could play a more affirmative role. We just don't, for the most part, we don't know how, right? Yeah. So we don't have the tools. And yes, there's New York and San Francisco and Silicon Valley, but that's not most of the country, right? So even though 70% of the GDP and the population is in metros, that's not mostly New York and even Boston and San Francisco and Silicon Valley. So what will work in Salt Lake City or in the Sacramento area or whatever, our strategy has to work in those places as well, and not only the places that have 20 million people in them or 10 million people in them. But we're not. When I run, I don't know very many mayors that train for any sort of global competency, right, around these issues. And so what do? We do what folks in other sectors do. Well, I see that city over there, 10 years, that city over there, they're Green City USA, they're Green City, I'm Green City USA. No, I'm the biotech hub. And these are all completely abstracted from any sense even of your own local economy, much less what's going on in any sort of global dynamics. And so to expect that even the mid-sized city mayors, for example, would know how to be effective is ridiculous. I mean, it's crazy that we've ever thought that could happen. There's no institute for that. There's no network for that. And so I think partly designing the systems and the talent infrastructure for those leaders, because they will be. The mayor of Salt Lake City or Portland is going to be by definition a major player. As I said earlier, I don't think they don't drive everything, but they're certainly on that bus, and they need to have and unlike other folks in their cognates in the private sector, they may not have emerged through that organization because of their knowledge around these trends and opportunities. So we need to do a better job of helping metro decision makers be better at understanding the global game.
There's a question over there.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Teresa Nelson. I'm a professor at the Business School at Simmons College in Boston. I guess the first is sort of a stand-back observation. I hear you talking with a standard of looking for government to be rational in its support. And I mean that sincerely in the classic sense, rather than as a complex system, and rather than as a stakeholder-driven system. And I just think we have to think really carefully about that in terms of what the values are that are embedded in the sort of decision-making. The other contradiction I hear, and you've just brought it out in this last comment quite a bit, is starting off saying, that government's getting in the way and complaining about the role of government, but then turning really to saying that government has to provide the solution. So I think there's clearly we're at a difficult and critical moment in the United States, and things are tough. But politics and government have always been intertwined. That's nothing new. Government has always been a little bit behind in terms of innovation and creativity and knowing what to do. The values that government have are not 100% aligned with the private sector, and that's the way we've decided to have our system. So I think we need to explore more complex systems theory and how that's applied to these sorts of situations. So that was my comment, and then I did have a question, thank you. We certainly, coming back to the global conversation, talk a lot about other models of how private sector and government cooperate. So we've talked a lot about Asia, but recently I've been doing quite a bit of work in France on the competitive pole model. And speaking from Boston, where we've just lost a mayor who was quite successful in developing the city and its innovative capacity, I think in quite an extraordinary way. How ticked off everyone was when New York City, Mayor Bloomberg is trying to create life science centers and incubators in New York City, and how does that make sense, right? But then I'm going back to the comments about Taiwan and China, and we want the United States to be innovative, right? And part of the reason is that we have this inner competitiveness, and we're not organized, and we're not sort of distributing the economy like I see France and Japan doing. So I don't know how we work our way out of that, and to what degree in this conversation about making value, we actually have to think about whether the national government, given global conditions, has to play a larger role in coordinating where certain things are going to happen in the country. And I think that's a really big question. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I want to just start by, to your first point, I don't think that I don't think that I implied that government should provide the solution, other than to say that in certain instances, if government is going to be proactive, it ought to be in a way that is helpful to value creation as opposed to harmful, which in many instances, when government is proactive, it can be harmful because it's reacting to political pressures that are individual and not kind of holistically looking at the overall good. And that was sort of, it gets to the mayor's point about having too much granular input. As far as the concept of sort of the federal government stepping in and assessing where the I don't know, where the focus of of certain areas of value creation should be nationally. I mean, my first reaction to that is, geez, they're even more dysfunctional than we are. I don't know that that's a good idea. And you want to take, I mean, New York usually is an example of dysfunctional politics, but I can say for the last 3 years at least, we've been very proud to say we think that the federal government is much more dysfunctional than we are. And there's a lot of reasons for that. I mean, I think there's you know, I think the primary system being so variable creates political problems across the country. I think terms are too short. I don't think anybody should be running for 2 years. But that's a personal viewpoint. But I guess my ultimate point would be that you still have to have some local, naturally occurring strengths. Some of them are infrastructure, higher ed, you know, having adequate water supply. I mean, you can't make snow in the desert, right? You need to have some basic fundamental elements for value creation to occur. And some of the decisions as to where those occur they're gonna evolve naturally because other things just won't work there. But there are things that the federal government isn't going to be aware of, or people at a higher level aren't going to be aware of, that they're not going to see what causes the value creation. And I think I'd go back to my gaming company example. No one would ever say, well, Troy, New York, obviously, is where, you know, where we should be making really high-level computer games that create a huge amount of value because of the revenue and the jobs created and sort of the creative energy that goes into programming these games. That happened all on its own, and it happened for reasons that have nothing to do with government, has everything to do with the presence of a few individuals and higher ed. I mean, so I don't think you could ever look from the state level even, and definitely not the federal level, and say, well, this is going to be an IT gaming programming hub. It just wouldn't happen.
So we have only a few minutes left, and I want to give as many opportunities as we ask to questions. At the back of the room.
I just wanted to suggest that before we go wishing for too much more from the federal government, we have to be very cautious about it. Just take a look at healthcare. As the mayor knows, historically, you've lost virtual control of your healthcare system in any city. That's basically in the hands of Washington. The Department of Health and Human Services, the HUD and its predecessors in slum clearance, they basically, federal policy wiped out minority entrepreneurship. There is no black-owned culture or business culture in the country as a result of some clearance. It was well intended. This is the outcome. And if we think about just research, basic research in medicine, we've watched over 20 years a decline in the number of discoveries, even as the number of NIH dollars has gone straight up. About 20 years ago, the Congress decided that there were as many good research scientists out in states we never heard of. And 20 years ago, basically, 10 medical centers basically had a monopoly on research money from NIH, Johns Hopkins being one of them. If you're a scientist at Johns Hopkins or Stanford, it's a lot harder to have multiple grants these days because there's a scientist someplace in a state, and I don't want to give offense to any, so I won't pick a hypothetical state, where we know that the clustering of smarter people just doesn't happen. And this is a direct result of politics and the federal policy to somehow smooth out resource distribution, but the implications have been clearly that we've reduced the amount of new discoveries in medicine as a result.
Anyone else? Questions? Short questions, please. Brief ones, so that we can get as many people to ask.
Very short. I just want to share you one of the points why I'm here. You know, I'm here, I'm worried about how my grandchildren is going to be educated. So therefore, my question to the panel and all the rest is, do you know how much knowledge or information kids receive? I'm talking about younger ones, getting from the internet versus the classroom instructions. And would there be any necessity of not censoring the content of internet, but just to teach kids how to think, how to ask questions, how to take defeat? And I think this will be a very important factor for the future education.
That's a comment. Any other comments or questions? Yes, back the room.
Great panel, guys. I have one concern that I'll just mention. For probably 10 years, I've been involved in some groups and fixing the immigration problem where you can attach a green card to a high-level technical capability when someone graduates has been worked very, very hard for a long time. And so what I'm wondering about is too many recommendations going to government at the same time, if it's a government issue, may water down what you're trying to get done. And I was wondering if you guys could just pick one thing. This is one I tend to think about, and say if we could only do one thing to make the situation better out of your own backyard, what would you chase?
I'll let you go first.
Well, I think the suggestion I made in two different ways, but I think it's the same thing, which is on the school side, this skill certification, badging, competency work, which is work that needs to get done, but it's powerful in terms of both the signals and its ability to help undermine the structural problems that we have in education across the board, without being a strategy for how to get in some new education reform battle, which will go nowhere. But it's the same one on the government side, which is metrics and badges of effectiveness, both strategy-wise, but also in terms of governments themselves and the rest of the ecosystem. And we need to understand that better. So essentially, providing the quantitative and qualitative tools to demystify both of those, demystify what it means to be college and career ready for kids. And what it means to be an effective actor in the ecosystem for governments and others.
Last brief comment from you, Heather.
I mean, that's a really hard question, but I think what I would do is I would say I would rip down the walls between the private sector, education, and government. And I mean K through 12, all the way through higher ed. Remove all the barriers, let everybody collaborate. Let's stop worrying about whose turf it is and who's getting involved, and start opening up the doors so that kids, when they're in 5th grade and 6th grade, can imagine what an applied skill, what they're learning, how that actually works in real life. And they have the enthusiasm to follow through and really focus on what's interesting to them, because that's where innovation is going to come from. And we don't know what is it going to be IT or biotech or some other thing that I can't even think of. But if the barriers are gone, at least there'll be full communication between all the involved parties.
Well, let's give a big round of applause to the panelists over here.